nearly every one of the conversations that we've looked at over the past couple of months has been just one passage, right? One interaction. So last week we saw the time when Jesus talked with Zacchaeus, and the only time that shows up is in Luke chapter 19, for instance. And so, many of the conversations that we've had are like this, and we've had the opportunity to see Jesus interacting with so many different types of people. And I think this is one of the things that sort of brings out the concept of the Bible being the greatest book. If you've never thought about it this way or put all of these together like we've done in the series, sometimes we forget as we read the Bible that these were real people, right? You know, we read the Bible and there are words on the page and we do our daily reading or whatever it is. You hear the message or the teaching or the Bible study, whatever, and you read it and you're like, okay, it happened. It was a long time ago. It's just words on a page. But these were real people. These were real people with real issues, real problems, real loves, real hates, real jobs, real families, real hurts. And each one of these people that we've been able to sort of eavesdrop into the conversation has been someone that Jesus dealt with very personally, right where they were with whatever it was that they were facing at that time. And I hope that you have benefited. If you've been listening or watching, you've been here, you haven't been here, I hope that you've had some kind of benefit from the series as we've been looking at these very specific questions. How did Jesus talk to the person? Whoever it was, man, woman, it didn't matter whether they were rich, whether they were poor, it didn't matter what their job was, didn't matter what their ethnic background was. Jesus interacted with them in a very specific way based on where they were in their lives at that time. And we've been asking, how did Jesus do that? Which of the truths, I mean, Jesus had all the truth, right? But there were certain things at certain times that he decided to bring out and left so many other things unsaid. And for many of us, that's a good pattern right there, isn't it? We don't have to share everything we know. Sometimes it's best to leave some stuff unsaid. And Jesus left a lot of stuff unsaid in each of these conversations. And then there's always the self-evaluation question. Is this me? If I placed myself in that situation, would the same conversation have occurred? Even if the details were a little bit different, obviously. But is this me? Or is this maybe I have someone in my sphere of influence who is dealing with some of these very same things? How do I get to interact with them? How can I minister to the people around me based on how Jesus ministered to that person? And so we've been working through these, and we've seen 7 different conversations so far throughout the Gospels, and today we're on our 8th, and next week, like I said, we'll finish up the series with Jesus talking to the thief on the cross. Obviously, that was a short conversation, but there's a lot of powerful truth in there as well. Today, Jesus will stand before Pontius Pilate. He was the Roman procurator or governor over Judea at that time. And it was very interesting where how he interacts with the people is based a lot within his own personal struggles. Okay, he was appointed directly by Caesar. Okay, there was only one person between Pilate and Caesar, and it was sort of like a regional type guy, but Pilate had direct access to Caesar of the Roman Empire. Okay, he was placed there personally. He ruled over Israel and Judea in that area for 10 years. Okay, including for a few years before Jesus began his ministry, and then for a few years after Jesus was crucified. So Pilate is there for a long time, and Caesar sort of likes him, but he sort of doesn't, because Pilate is a brash guy, okay? He does not like the Jewish people, and so why he was put here to begin with is sort of up for debate, but he does not like the Jewish people. He does not hide the fact that he does not like the Jewish people, okay? He doesn't care anything about them. And yet there he was, ruling over this area, and he did his best to stay out of the way. He lived in a fortress down on the Mediterranean Sea. And he came into Jerusalem and interacted with the Jewish people only when he had to. And this was one of the times that he had to, because the Jewish nation was celebrating Passover. Now, quick review. What was Passover about? Why were they celebrating Passover? What is Passover? What's the celebration? Okay, when the angel of death passed over certain houses while they were in Egypt. And then what happened after that? They left Egypt. It was the Passover is the remembrance of Israel being delivered from oppression by another nation. Can you see why maybe Rome was sort of on edge whenever Passover time came around? Because here's Israel celebrating as a nation, God delivered us from our oppressors. And the Roman governor is right there. And the Roman soldiers are right there. And especially at this time, the people of Israel, because of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, they knew Messiah should be coming anytime. And they didn't know exactly when he was going to be born, how old he was going to be. They knew he would be born in Bethlehem at some point, from Micah chapter 5. They knew a lot. They knew all the prophecies, but they didn't know when he was going to be born, how old he was going to be. They didn't know how they would recognize him. And when Jesus came through and he did all the miracles and he said, I'm the Messiah, some of them said, yes, you are. Some of them said, you might be. And some of them said, no, you're not. And so the entire nation was divided over who Jesus was. But the fact that there was a guy claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be the deliverer in Jerusalem at Passover when they were celebrating deliverance, that put Rome on edge. And so Pilate, during this time, had gone from his fortress where he hung out on the Mediterranean Sea into Jerusalem, into either a palace or a fortress there, because he had to be protected, obviously, just to keep his finger on the pulse of Israel to make sure things didn't get out of hand. Oh, and by the way, one more thing about Pilate. He was on notice from Caesar. There had already been 2 riots, and the third time was going to be the third strike. And Pilate, if another riot broke out and he lost control over these Jewish people, Caesar was going to pull him from his position, maybe even kill him, just because that's, what they would do sometimes, right? So not only was Rome on edge, not only was Pilate on edge just because of the time of year, but he was on edge even more because if anything happened, he could lose his job, he could lose his life. He could not afford to have another problem. And so what happens? Here comes Jesus. This is the last thing that Pilate needed this week, really. Okay? That's the last thing he needed. And so, as we look through the passages here, and I say passages because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all speak to this in some way. Matthew and Mark are pretty much identical, 4 or 5 verses, very short. Luke adds a little bit of detail, but still only about 5 verses, very short. John gives us a lot of detail. So what we're going to do is we'll look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, briefly get the setting, try to pull out some principles from there, and then we'll go to John and really unpack the conversation that Jesus had, okay? So we're going to be in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23, if you'd like to turn or scroll or flip there, whatever. Matthew 27, we'll just read these very quickly, just to get the scene here, and then pick out a few principles that we see. So Matthew 27, just 4 verses, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, Matthew 27, 11. That's the whole thing, is with Jesus in his conversation with Pilate. So Matthew 27:11, Jesus stood before the governor. The governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You say so." Now, some people think that was a question. Are you saying that? And the reason will show up in John. But let's just put that on hold for now. But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not respond. Pilate said to him, "Don't you hear how many charges they're bringing against you?" But he did not answer even one accusation, so that the governor was quite amazed. That's it. That's all Matthew has to say. That's the whole thing, okay? So let's go to Mark. Mark chapter, where's my cursor here? Mark chapter 15, okay? And we'll be looking at verses 1 through 5. Again, very short. Mark chapter 15. Early in the morning, verse 1, after forming a plan, the chief priests with the elders and the experts in the law and the whole Sanhedrin tied Jesus up, led him away, handed him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He replied, "You say so." And does this sound familiar to anybody? Almost word for word. Then the chief priests began to accuse him repeatedly. So Pilate asked him again, "Have you nothing to say? See how many charges they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. And that's all Mark has to say about Jesus and Pilate. We're going to get through this very quickly, aren't we? No. Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. Didn't know that you could go through the Gospels this quickly, right? Yeah. Luke 23, look at verses 1 through 5. Again, only just very, very short. Now, there is other stuff with Pilate and Jesus as far as Jesus standing there, Pilate condemns him, all that. But as far as the conversation with those two together, this is all that these guys wrote for us, okay? Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. Then the whole group of them, Mark said that that's the priests and the Pharisees and the experts in the law and everybody, brought Jesus before Pilate. They begin to accuse him, saying, now here's where Luke adds a little bit. Here are the three accusations that they brought to Pilate. Number one, we found this man subverting our nation. Number two, forbidding us to pay the tribute tax to Caesar. And number three, claiming that he himself is Christ, or Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked Jesus. This is the only one he cared about, by the way. That's why he asked him about this particular one. "Are you the king of the Jews?" He replied, "You say so." These guys are all doing. And Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they persisted in saying, "He incites the people by teaching throughout all Judea. It started up in Galilee and ended up here." And that's all Luke has to say on the topic. Okay? Now, from these three, before we go into John, from these three, we can see a couple of things. First of all, let's just grab an outline. Okay? So Matthew and Mark are basically identical. They're just going to do very, very quickly. They're going to say Jesus was placed before Pilate and charged. Okay? Now, the real charge behind closed doors in the Sanhedrin, the real charge was blasphemy. You, being a man, made yourself out to be God. But Rome doesn't care about that. Okay, that would never have stood up in Pilate's court. Okay, so they had to come up with something else that Pilate might care about, and that was the whole king issue. They tried the tax issue, but two of these three things were not even true, were they? Was Jesus subverting the nation? Was he leading them astray? Well, he was leading them away from the religious leaders, but he wasn't leading them astray. What was he actually doing? Where was Jesus leading the people? Back to God, right? He wasn't leading them astray, so that one's false. That one doesn't even. Secondly, did he forbid the people to pay the Roman tribute tax? Exactly. When he was asked on that very specific question, he said, "Show me the coin. Whose face is on it?" Well, it's Caesar's face on the coin. He said, "Well, if it's Caesar's, give it to him. And if it's God's, give it to him." That doesn't sound like forbidding them to pay the tax. In fact, it sounds like you said he told them to pay the tax if this is what you have to do. So that's a false charge. And then he made himself to be, claimed to be the king of the Jews. Now that one catches Pilate's attention. Rome is a pluralistic society, the same as the United States of America. You can believe what you want, okay? Rome was, they didn't care what you believed. They didn't care what church you belonged to. They didn't care anything about that. If you wanted to believe in the Roman gods or the Greek gods, you wanted to believe in no God, you wanted to believe in your own little made-up God, they could not have cared less as long as you swore allegiance to the empire and to Caesar specifically. As long as you were allegiant, or as long as you were swore allegiance to uphold and protect Rome, they didn't care what you believed. So if the chief priests and the religious leaders had come and said, he's claiming to be Messiah, he's claiming to be a prophet, he's claiming to be a... Who cares? Who cares? Believe what you want. So they had to come and say, he's claiming to be king. He's trying to set up a little kingdom within your empire. Now Rome cares. Because you can believe anything you want. What you don't get to do is set up your own little kingdom. Okay? And so that's the one that perked up, in Pilate's ears. He's like, okay, let's go down this one. And actually, it's sort of, depending on I think all three of these so far, it's pretty snarky the way he asked it, because in the Greek language you can emphasize words like we do, but it's written, so we have to, word order tells us what they're emphasizing. And so because of the word order of his question, it's almost like, you're the king of the Jews? Really? He's looking at this Jesus guy standing before him tied up. He's like, you? You don't look like a king, you don't act like a king, you don't, really? You're king of the Jews? And Jesus is like, you said it. Yeah, I don't find any problem with this guy. That's how it went down. He's like, I'm not seeing it. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it. So Jesus is placed before Pilate. He's charged with those things. Pilate asks him that question, really snarky question. Really? You? Jesus, very short response. Pilate's like, yeah, I don't see a problem. So they have to say, oh no, he's got all these things. And then they just kept sort of shouting over each other. What about this? What about this? What about this? And Jesus doesn't say anything. Now, part of that is a legal thing, because those were not actually charges, that they were just accusations, but they were not formal charges. They didn't want Pilate to act on those things. They wanted him to act on the charge that he was claiming to be king and setting up a kingdom. Now they're just yelling bad things. He's a bad guy. He does this, he does this, he does this. Jesus is like, there's not even a reason to respond to that. Pilate didn't ask him about those things. He had no response. The only thing Pilate asked was, don't you hear all this stuff? Doesn't matter. And Pilate, it says, was amazed. The text says Pilate was amazed. Why do you think he was amazed? What amazed him about this whole situation, do you think? Put yourself in his shoes for a second. What do you think amazed Pilate? Why? So he wasn't defending himself. Why would that amaze him? Because everybody defends themselves. If you're dragged before the Roman governor and you've got this accusation, who in their right mind is not going to say, no, that's not me, it's not me, it was him, right? It's somebody else, right? He's not defending himself. He's just like, whatever. Is there anything else? Any other reason that you would be amazed and you would be surprised if you were Pilate in this case?
How calm Jesus was.
Yeah. Not only is he not defending himself, he's just standing. He's very calm, quiet. He's probably not nervous. Of course, from a spiritual, from our perspective, we know Jesus knows why he's there. He knows what's going to happen. He's got the whole thing under control. He looks like everybody else is under control doing things to him, but he's really the one in control of this whole thing, isn't he? Right? And he's calm, cool, collected, the whole thing. And Pilate's like, that doesn't make sense. Good. Does it remind you does it remind you of an Old Testament prophecy? An Old Testament prophecy, does this just remind anybody? Isaiah 53. Like a lamb before the slaughter and like a sheep before its shearers is dumb, he opened not his mouth, right? He did not even open his mouth. This was prophesied 700 years earlier in Isaiah 53. When he stood before his accusers, he stood before the governor, he wouldn't say a thing. And he didn't. It's just like, it's not worth it. I'll answer one question and then we'll move on. Let's see here. We've already gone through their charges. Jesus was misleading the Jewish people. That's not true. He was forbidding them from paying the Roman tribute tax. That's not true. He claimed to be king of the Jews. That is true in a sense, but it turned out to not be not the way they intended it. As I was reading this week, I came across a thing that I thought was very profound and important, so I wanted to share it with you. This concept of silence. Never underestimate the power of silence. Because I want to think about Jesus. We're talking all this time about Jesus' conversations, and yet we haven't really gotten too much of a conversation yet. We've seen Jesus being very quiet in this one, and it shakes up the conversation. And this particular writer says there are at least 5 times that silence can be very powerful. It can be in terms of admiration, where you admire something so much there are just no words to say, right? And it's very silent. In fact, I was reading or watching something about Star Wars just a week or two ago, and when it does connect, it's okay. When Star Wars first came out, 1977, when Star Wars first came out, as it showed in theaters all over the States, at the end of the movie, people were jumping up and clapping and yelling and they thought it was great, right? As it went overseas, George Lucas remembered that they showed it in a Japanese theater in Japan. Maybe you've heard this before. And at the end of the movie, the whole theater was completely silent. Not a single sound. And he thought, oh man, they hate it. They hate it. It wasn't until later that he found out that in the Japanese culture, at least at that time, silence shows more admiration and respect than applause. So for the entire theater to be silent was just as impactful from their standpoint as an entire theater erupting in cheers and applause would be here. And he learned the power of silence from an admiration standpoint, and I thought that was pretty cool. Wouldn't that be unnerving if you were there? Just because of our culture? That would be just like, what's going on? I can't handle it. We're not a very silent people, right? But silence can be very powerful sometimes. Admiration, sometimes there's just no words to say. Of course, silence of contempt, if you find something contemptible, it's just not worth replying. Right? I'm just not even going to say anything to that because I hate it so much or whatever. So silence is powerful there. Fear, right? When you're afraid, sometimes you're afraid to speak up. And in that time, silence can be very powerful. Not so much on the situation, but in us, right? Because we're so afraid, we don't want to say something. And that can be for all sorts of reasons. Hurt. Sometimes we get hurt so badly, sort of the opposite, the negative side of admiration. Admiration is positive, there are just no words. Hurt is negative, there are just no words. There's just nothing to say when you're in that much pain. And then tragedy, he listed as a separate category. And he says this is where Jesus found himself, in this category of tragedy, where it's not that there are no words. It's not that he was afraid to speak up. There's just nothing that he could say that was going to change the situation at all. The communication was broken. There was no bridge. Nobody was listening. There were things to say. And in fact, when we get into John, he did have a longer conversation personally with Pilate. But at this case, when the people are yelling all of these accusations and how horrible of a guy he is and why he needs to be killed and all this stuff, Jesus is like, I could talk. There are things to say, but You're not listening anyway. And so he used the power of silence to just stand there. Just like was prophesied in Isaiah 53. And Pilate was amazed at the silence. I thought that was pretty cool. Was that beneficial? Maybe just a different way to think through some of these things. One more thought about just in the Gospels here. Matthew 27 and Mark 15 actually say the exact same thing. And we can pop over there for Matthew 27, verse 18. And Mark 15:10 rather says the exact same thing, so we don't have to look at it. But notice this, verse 18. For he knew, this is talking about Pilate. For he knew that they, the religious leaders, handed Jesus over. Why? Out of envy. Out of envy. Pilate was not new to this game. He was a politician. He knew they were politicians. He knew just listening, just looking at the guy in front of him, listening to all of the charges and the accusations and everything, that they, and this is a little bit further down, they were not backing off. He goes out and says, I don't find anything wrong with this guy. And instead of backing off, they actually get stronger. He knows something is going on. And he's a politician, and he was smart enough to figure out, it's not that Jesus is the problem. It's that these guys have an attitude against Jesus for some reason. Maybe he didn't know what the whole reason was, but there was no reason for them to bring Jesus to him on these trumped up charges. Right? And Mark 15:10 says the exact same thing. He knew that they had handed him over because of envy. There was something special about this guy that they didn't like. And they were willing to kill to get him out of the way. That sure says a whole lot more about them than it does about Jesus, doesn't it? All right. That brings us now to the Gospel of John. And there are two passages that we need to look at. One of them just is very similar to this one, fleshes out a few more details. And then the second passage is another private conversation. So John chapter 18, verse 28 is where we will pick up the first part of the story, the conversation here. John chapter 18, verse 28. Now, we're going to flesh out some of the situation around what we have just read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? So John 18:28, they brought Jesus from Caiaphas. He was the high priest at the time, to where Jesus had been tried or stood before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. They brought him from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's residence. So now we're coming to Pilate, right? It was very early in the morning. John adds this note: they did not go into the governor's residence so that they would not be ceremonially defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now, this is really interesting, because if they had gone into a Gentile person's house, they would have been defiled according to their laws. It wasn't even the Mosaic law, but according to their laws, they would have become unclean and would not be able to celebrate the Passover, which kicks off an entire week of celebration, the week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? Think of the irony that's going on here. They are not willing to go into a Gentile person's house because it might make them unclean, while they plot murder, while they just did something that was illegal in the Mosaic law, which is to have a trial overnight. God did not allow trials overnight. All of their interactions with Jesus, they arrested him in the garden at night, tried him several times overnight before they brought Jesus to Pilate early in the morning, right? But I wouldn't want to go into a Gentile person's house because I might get ceremonially unclean. See how twisted their thinking is in this whole thing? They're so messed up that literally they're not thinking straight. Okay? And so they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So, verse 29, Pilate came outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Has to be formal, right? They replied, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." So, what accusation do you bring against this guy? They don't even have anything. They're like, we've already tried him. We know he's a criminal. We just need you to sign off on letting us kill him, or you kill him. We've already determined he's a criminal. He's a bad guy. Okay, well, they probably assumed that he would just rubber stamp whatever they wanted. That did happen a lot. He didn't really want to be involved in the messy affairs of Jewish life. He didn't know their regulations. He just didn't care, right? He hated them. He didn't care about them. He had to be here. He's waiting for his next appointment. Really, this is Pilate's life. Okay, you think you've got a bad job? So did Pilate. Really, I mean that's his life. They thought that they could just bring this Jesus in. They could, make up a few things and just say, "We know he's a bad guy. We've just tried him ourselves." Pilate would be like, "Fine, get him out of here, whatever." But something Pilate noticed. He's like, "No, I want to go ahead and I'll listen to this one." Oh, you're not supposed to listen to this one. He's a bad guy. Pilate said, "Listen. If he's a bad guy, take him yourselves. You do your own thing. Pass judgment on him according to your own law." And they're like, "We cannot legally put anyone to death." And that is generally true. Rome, for the most part, took away the capital punishment option from the Jewish people. There were times, Acts chapter 7, they killed Stephen. As he's standing before them preaching the gospel of Jesus. Some people say, well, that wasn't exactly capital punishment, that was just a mob. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. They tried to kill Jesus a couple of times previously, and people would argue the same thing, that was just a mob. Here's what's really interesting, but we see that in verse 32, so let's go on. This happened to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken when he indicated what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus had already prophesied how he was going to die. What would it be? Crucifixion. Okay? Jews don't crucify. It's impossible. In fact, nobody on the planet except for Rome crucified like this. Which means Jesus, in his prophecy, multiple times, had already indicated or implied at least that somehow Rome was going to be involved. Okay? If the Jewish people, if the religious leaders were going to kill him, how would they have done it? What was their method? Death by stoning, right? Push him off of a cliff and throw rocks at him. Okay? Push him into a pit and throw rocks at him. If that had happened, that would have caused 3 problems. Okay? Of course, did I put this on a slide? I don't think I did. No, I didn't. Okay. That would have caused 3 problems. Problem number 1. If they would have thrown him off of a cliff or into a pit or something and thrown stones at him to kill him that way, it would have broken his bones, right? And the prophecy from the Old Testament is that not a single one of his bones would be broken. They could not possibly have done that and still fulfilled prophecy. He couldn't die that way. Okay? Number 2. Had they killed him by death by stoning, he would have been executed only by the nation of Israel, not by Jews and Gentiles, the entire world. And all the way through the Old Testament, he was going to be put to death by the world, not just Israel. So that's 2 reasons why they had to come to Rome, and they didn't even know it. They were fulfilling prophecy and didn't even know it. God's in charge of this whole thing. Number 3. Had he been pushed off of a cliff or pushed into a pit and thrown stones at him, they would have broken his bones. They would have just Israel. And Jesus said in John chapter 3 in the conversation with Nicodemus, if you remember from several weeks ago, or from just reading it, the Son of Man will be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness from the book of Numbers, right? And he will be lifted up, and that's how he will pay for sins. Jesus said earlier in the book of John, and if I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Twice at least he talked about being lifted up. You don't get lifted up if you're thrown down a cliff or thrown into a pit and had rocks thrown at your head and your chest to kill you. Had what Pilate said, just take him yourself and take care of him yourself. I will rubber stamp. If you want to go kill him, go kill him. And they said no. It wasn't because they wouldn't have had the authority. He would have given them the authority to do it. It's because God was in control of this whole thing. And God had prophesied hundreds or thousands of years in advance exactly what was going to happen. They were at this time unknowingly fulfilling prophecy, even in their hatred. Now, some people will look at that and say, well, then they should be off the hook. They're doing things that they were just, predestined to do to begin with. I don't think that's true. Okay? I don't think that's true. Even Judas, the person who betrayed Jesus and got paid for it, didn't have to do it. Now, was it prophecy somebody would? Yes, somebody would. But the prophecy never said Judas, the son of Iscariot, had to do it. Anybody could have done it. Judas chose to do it. You know who sat on the Sanhedrin in the middle of all this stuff? A man by the name of Nicodemus. He wasn't involved in turning Jesus over to Pilate. The whole Sanhedrin as a unit was, but at least one man stood back and said, I will not be a part of this. And so even though they were fulfilling prophecy, it did not mean that everybody, these individual people, God had said, you have to do this and I'm going to judge you for it. This was still their own choice to do this to Jesus and to stand before Pilate. We've got to be very careful saying that God makes us do things or, the devil makes me do things or whatever. God, all the way through here, God says you have the choice to do this. Even within fulfilling prophecy, there is a choice that can be made. These people didn't have to do this, and Nicodemus proves that that was the case. Well, so, verse 33, Pilate went back into the governor's residence. So Jesus is inside. Okay, they took Jesus inside. The other people are standing outside because they don't want to be ceremonially unclean. Pilate comes out, finds out what the accusation is, goes back in, and he's going to question Jesus semi-privately. I mean, it's not like Jesus and Pilate are the only two people in the room, but his accusers were outside. They didn't get to hear the conversation. So verse 33. Pilate went back into the governor's residence, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And again, same thing. Really, you? Okay, you I don't understand. And Jesus replied, now this is why in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, some translators and commentators will put a question mark instead of a period there, because it just says, you said it. Well, here's the full reply. Are you saying this on your own initiative, or have others told you about me? Do you think I'm the king of the Jews? Or are you just repeating back what other people have said? Why are you asking? Why are you asking? Who's on trial here? It sure isn't Jesus. Jesus is like, I tell you what, how about if I ask the questions and you give me the answers? I'm in charge here. Pilate's like, no, I'm in charge. Pilate says, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own people and your own chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? You really think I'm doing this? You think I'm making this stuff up? They're the ones saying it. Don't you know you shouldn't cross them? What have you done to them that's caused them to bring you to me? Why are you even here, really? And Jesus replied, verse 36, my kingdom is not from this world. It does not come from this world. It is not given to me by this world. I do have a kingdom, but it is not anything that this world can give to me. Now, some people will look at this and say, aha, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Therefore, it's just a spiritual kingdom. It's not really going to be earthly. It's not really going to be literal. He's not really going to come back. It's got to be a spiritual kingdom, and we're in the kingdom now, and he's ruling through us. And they use this verse as one of their proofs for that. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Okay, I like the net translation. I think is better. Not my kingdom is not of this world, which is what some translations say, but it says my kingdom is not from this world. Okay, and I think that does better actually represent what he would say. Because if my kingdom were from this world, do you really think I would be standing here tied up in front of you? Really? If I am setting up a kingdom that the Old Testament prophets said is going to be bigger than any other empire and kingdom in the whole world, you really think I'm going to be standing here tied up in front of you if that's the kingdom that I have? I don't think so. Right? He said, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over, not just to you, but to the Jewish authorities. Okay? We wouldn't be here. We would not be having this conversation if what you think is a kingdom and what I think is a kingdom are the same thing. Okay, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. And Pilate said, so you are a king? Jesus said, you say that I'm a king. For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world. Hey, we're coming into Christmas time. Sometimes people talk about Jesus is the reason for the season. Well, Jesus gives the reason for the season right here, right? For this reason I was born, for this reason I came into this world. By the way, notice these two things. For this reason I was born and I came into this world. What's the difference between these two? What's different between these two? There's a little bit of an emphasis difference. Okay, being born emphasizes the humanity part. Choosing to come into the world, but that means that he had to exist beforehand, right? Outside of the world. He existed outside of this being born. He was born into this world, humanity, and he chose to come into this world, emphasizing his deity. Isn't that cool? Isn't that very cool? He brought both of these things out. He didn't just say, well, here's why I was born. But I also came. I chose to come. This was an intentional act coming into this world beyond just being born. To testify to the truth. Why is Jesus here? Why did Jesus come? What's the reason for the season? To reveal truth. To reveal truth. There is some truth that is certainly available had Jesus not come. We sang about it this morning. Evan referenced Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all of the earth. The heavens declare. Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. Romans 1 tells us that people will stand before God without excuse because we have conscience inside of us. Romans 2. And we have creation outside of us. Romans 1. Psalm 8. Psalm 19. We have a ton of truth about God, but none, not our conscience and not creation, tells us who God is as a personal God who is full of love and grace and righteousness and holiness and all that. We don't know anything about the person of God. Creation and conscience just tells us that there is a being out there somewhere. We could know about God with creation and conscience, but we could not really know God without Him speaking. And Hebrews chapter 1 says that God long ago spoke in various times and in various ways to the Jewish fathers and the prophets and everything, but in these last days He has spoken to us in a Son. Jesus came to reveal the truth about who God is and what He's doing in this world. John chapter 1, we'll read it here during our Christmas service. You may read it and hear it elsewhere, is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and all of that. But just a few verses later in John chapter 1:18 says that Jesus came to explain the Father. We would never know God as a father had Jesus not come. And he said, I did not come to rule as king. That is one thing that will indeed happen, but I came to explain the truth about who God is and what's going on in this world. And everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate said, what is truth? Now, some people look at that and say he's just sort of a snarky, what is truth? Some people say more of philosophical, what is truth? You know, we don't know. There's no tone, right? It's sort of like texting and emails. You can't get a tone from just the words on the page. So it could have gone a couple of different ways. But how would you like to stand before a judge who asks that question? The question is not what is the truth. That's what we want a judge to ask, right? We don't want a judge asking, what's truth? That's a bad judge to be in front of, right? And Jesus, from a human perspective, Jesus' life literally was in his hands. This guy who didn't know or didn't care about what truth was. Go over just one chapter, and we'll see a couple more verses. And John 19, verses 8 through 11. Okay? Because Pilate goes out, talks to the people, the Jewish religious leaders and everything. He tries to offer a different guy instead of Jesus. And he comes back in to talk to Jesus. Verses 8 through 11. When Pilate heard what they said, which was, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. We don't want him. He claimed to be the Son of God. When he heard what they said, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the governor's residence and said, where do you come from? Who are you anyway, right? But Jesus, what? No answer. He's done with that line of questioning. And Pilate's like, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have the authority to release you and to crucify you? And Jesus replied, you would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you from above. By the way, he did not say you have no authority. He did not reject Pilate's authority. He recognized Pilate's authority, but he reminded Pilate who he got it from. Okay? We can't use this and say, we don't like what you say. We reject your authority. Jesus stood there, the one who created everything, stood there in chains or ropes or whatever, all tied up in front of this guy who hated the fact that he was a Jew, that Jesus was a Jew, an anti-Semitic Roman who hated every second of this whole day, hated the whole feast, hated everything, would have loved nothing more than to just to flick Jesus back out to wherever he came from. And Jesus submitted to that man's authority right there. But he spoke truth, and he spoke it boldly, and he was willing to speak truth to power. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin. As we wrap this up, I want you to look, we'll just put this up here. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 11, this is really interesting. This is the only other time that Pilate shows up in the New Testament. Paul says this to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, but you, as a person dedicated to God, keep away from all of that, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil and stuff. Instead, pursue righteousness, godliness, faithfulness, love, endurance, gentleness. Compete well for the faith. Lay hold of that eternal life you were called for and made good confession for in the presence of many witnesses. I charge you before God who gives life to all things and Christ Jesus who made his good confession before Pontius Pilate. Isn't that cool? He used Jesus as the model of somebody who could stand in good conscience and speak truth, even in a bad situation, to obey this command without fault or failure until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, how did Jesus talk to Pilate? He spoke truth to authority. He was bold and respectful. He was respectful yet bold. Okay, he didn't back down. But he did not overstep where he should be at the time. He was guarded. He chose silence instead of words many times. He didn't say more than he was supposed to. He didn't say more than he needed to. A wise person does not always say everything that he or she knows. He was guarded with his words. He didn't say too much. He didn't say too little. He would not allow himself to be tripped over his own words. People have been trying to do that for years, right? Okay, he answered the question, and this is not even a spiritual principle. This is just a good political principle. If we're questioned by law enforcement or legal people or whatever, just answer the question that's in front of you, right? Don't go on bloviating with other stuff. Jesus did that. He knew that was the thing to do. How did he talk to Pilate? What truths did he share? He shared that God does have authority over all rulers. Okay, Daniel chapter 4 says that God is the one who places human governments and rulers into place, and we're still subject to them. Jesus said, I'm not a king yet, but I will be. I will have a kingdom, and it's going to be given to me by God. Okay, why didn't he bring that up to any of the other people that we've looked at so far? This concept of a kingdom, and he's going to be king, why has that never shown up in any of the conversations so far? Why? Okay, maybe because they wouldn't have believed. Is what? No, it wouldn't. It wasn't it's not prideful necessarily. If you're just, like I said, just speaking the truth. These are the facts, right? I don't think there was a pride thing in there. It could have been. I mean, Jesus was not prideful, but other people could have been. Certainly, that would have been a sin. What's that?
No one asked.
No one asked, right? Because the situation didn't call for it, right? Jesus, and this is one of the cool things about this whole series, is that Jesus spoke the truth that was necessary in that situation. He didn't tell people, here's all the truth you need to know. This is just, here's the situation, here's the conversation, let's talk about this, right? Every single one of these conversations so far. And so, here's our self-evaluation. Okay, we've seen all of these passages about how Jesus interacted with Pilate. Let's think about Pilate for just a second. Is this you? Is this me? Are we more concerned with what is safe and what is popular than we are with what is right, what is true? Pilate was just trying to keep the peace. Didn't really care what was true. He just didn't need another riot on his mark right now, right? Okay, he was more concerned with keeping the peace than he was speaking up for the truth. In fact, he tried. I don't find any fault in this man. Let's try to go a different way. No! Okay. Fine. Go kill him. Okay. He had the opportunity. Was Jesus going to be crucified? Yes, he was. It was prophesied. Did Pilate have to be the one to do it? No, he didn't. He had the choice. He had the opportunity, and he caved because he was more concerned about being popular, more concerned about being safe, more concerned about his own career, his own family, his own self, than he was with what was doing right. Well, we can identify with that sometimes too, can't we? Okay? Let's not do that. Let's not be a Pilate. On the flip side, we have Jesus, where we can stand firm and we can speak truth with a good conscience. Like Paul told Timothy, I charge you before Christ Jesus, who with a good conscience stood before Pontius Pilate. Which one are we going to be? Right? Which one are we going to be? Do we speak truth respectfully, yet boldly, even truth to power when we need to? Or do we cave, just say, well, whatever anybody else wants, doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong, we're just going to try to keep the peace. I mean, you got two completely opposite things going on here with Pilate and Jesus. And we have a choice. Which one are we going to be? Who is going to be our model? Which one will we emulate? I'm telling you, Thanksgiving is a perfect time to speak boldly. No, I'm just yet respectfully, as everybody's all gathered together. And, sometimes it is worth just keeping the peace, because what the conversation is just doesn't matter, right? Okay, that's part of the being guarded, choosing our words carefully, choosing the situations carefully. But when it's a matter of right and wrong, when it's a matter of truth and error, It doesn't matter whether we're standing before kings or peasants. It doesn't matter who it is. We should be willing to stand up and speak the truth, just like Jesus did.